I wasn't supposed to be here. Not today, not at this hotel lobby where the scent of polished wood mixed with faint perfume, and the soft hum of the air conditioner made the world feel smaller than it really was. But something, or maybe nothing at all, pulled me in, the way your feet sometimes find a path before your mind catches up. She was there, standing near the reception desk, flipping through a worn notebook with that quiet focus that made it impossible to look away. I'd seen her before, briefly, awkwardly, but today, she didn't feel distant. Today, she felt present. Confident in a way that didn't need to announce itself, every movement precise, deliberate, yet somehow relaxed. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping and brushing her cheek, softening the edges of her otherwise sharp presence. I cleared my throat, hoping to sound casual. It was impossible. My hands itched for something to do, pocket, pen, the edges of my jacket, but they only fidgeted. She looked up then. For a moment, the world narrowed to that glance, the kind that catches you off guard because it lingers just long enough to feel like it's seeing through you, but not in a way that shames you. There was a flicker of curiosity, maybe amusement, or maybe just recognition of someone out of place, and then she returned to her notebook as if nothing had happened. My chest tightened. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just a glance, but I knew better. The lobby was quiet, save for the soft tapping of her pen against the paper. I lingered near the coffee stand, pretending to fix a sugar packet in my hand, stealing glances that I didn't want her to notice. But she did. I caught the corner of her eyes, that subtle shift, as if she'd noticed me noticing her. Then something absurdly small happened, a chair scraped softly across the floor, a pen rolled, and I bent to pick it up, hand brushing hers by accident. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch. Just a pause, a shared spark that made my stomach twist, my pulse louder than the distant elevator ding. "You dropped this," she said, handing it over without looking directly at me, voice neutral, yet somehow threading warmth between the words. "Thanks," I muttered, my voice rougher than I expected. She smiled. "Just a fraction, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention." And then she went back to her notebook. But I couldn't. My fingers itched to touch something, anything connected to her, even that small piece of paper. My mind replayed the brush of our hands, the way her eyes had lingered just that fraction too long. I told myself to leave, that I had no business standing here, breathing the same air. And yet, every step away felt heavier, as if something unseen was holding me in place. The sound of her pen tapping, the soft crease of her brow when she concentrated, even the faint scent of her perfume mixed with coffee, it all pressed against me in ways I didn't want to untangle. I should have turned the corner, vanished, disappeared into the normal flow of life. But I didn't. I lingered. Watched. Waited for something I couldn't name. And as she tucked her notebook under her arm and glanced briefly in my direction, just a flicker, I caught it, a moment that wasn't meant for anyone else but us. A crack in the quiet armor of the world, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even now, I wonder if she knows how dangerous a single glance can be. It was the repair shop this time, not some polished hotel lobby. The smell of motor oil, old leather, and varnish hung in the air, clinging to everything. I had come to drop off a watch for a minor fix, but somehow, I ended up standing near her workbench again. She was crouched over a stack of invoices, sleeves rolled up, the faintest crease between her brows. "You shouldn't be doing this yourself," I said, pretending casual concern while sliding a rag across a nearby counter. She didn't look up. "I've handled worse," she murmured, voice clipped, careful. But there was a tremor in it, almost imperceptible, like she'd left something fragile exposed. I watched her hands then, the way her fingers hovered over the papers, tapping lightly as if deciding whether to sign, to fold, to toss. There was a subtle elegance to the fatigue etched across her knuckles, the slight tension in her shoulders. She wasn't someone who invited help, not really. That was obvious. I cleared my throat and tried again. Maybe let me, just for a second. She paused, finally lifting her gaze, and I caught it, hesitation, a shadow of doubt. Something almost human behind the controlled exterior. The briefest falter of a barrier. Fine, she said, with that faint edge of defiance, but her eyes softened, just enough for me to see that she was aware of how tired she looked. The way her lips pressed together, like she was holding herself upright against a weight only she could feel. As I reached over to adjust the papers, our hands brushed. She flinched slightly, then held still, letting the contact linger longer than necessary. I could feel the electricity in that moment, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't overt, she didn't say anything, but her fingers, her eyes, the tilt of her head, they all spoke louder than words. I noticed the quiet things about her then. The soft laugh she let out when a screw rolled off the bench and clattered against the floor, the almost imperceptible sigh when she leaned back to stretch, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Every small movement seemed to pull me closer, without either of us acknowledging it. You really don't have to, I started. I want to, she cut in, almost defensively. And then, softer, almost to herself, it's easier if I do it myself. The words were simple, but the weight behind them told me she was guarding more than just her pride. Maybe it was the years of having to prove herself, the moments where trust felt like a luxury. I didn't push further. I just watched, quietly, as she settled back into her work, letting her vulnerability linger like a quiet thread between us. Then, just as I reached for a small tool to hand her, our fingers touched again, longer this time, deliberate, or maybe neither of us had the courage to pull away. Her gaze met mine, a flicker, a pause in her otherwise precise rhythm. And in that shared silence, I realized I couldn't look away. The room, the workbench, the smell of varnish and oil, it all faded until the only thing that mattered was that brief, electric contact. She didn't speak, and I didn't either. But the air between us had shifted. A quiet acknowledgement, a soft charge, like we'd both crossed a line we hadn't named yet. And I knew, just for that moment, I wanted to linger there forever. The rain started softly, tapping against the windows like someone hesitant to intrude. By the time it had grown into a steady drizzle, we were still in the small office, the hum of the fluorescent light above mixing with the faint static of an old radio somewhere in the background. She sat at her desk, leaning slightly forward, the lines on her forehead more pronounced under the dull light, and I was perched on the edge of a chair, pretending to sort through paperwork I didn't really need to. She didn't look at me, but the air between us thickened anyway. I could feel it in the way her elbow brushed the stack of files I was holding, the faint brush of her shoulder as she shifted. Nothing overt, nothing intentional, or maybe everything was intentional, I couldn't tell. Then her phone buzzed sharply against the desk, startling both of us. I caught the glance she shot at it, sharp and fleeting, like a secret she didn't want to share. I didn't ask. I didn't want to. But the way her fingers hovered over the screen, then pulled back, made me wonder about the weight she carried in those quiet moments. Everything okay? I asked, softer than I intended. She lifted her gaze, meeting mine for just a heartbeat, eyes unreadable. Yeah, just some old business. She forced a small, polite smile and went back to the papers. But I noticed how her jaw tensed, how her hand lingered near the phone as if resisting something. We worked in near silence after that, the only sound the occasional scribble of her pen. Every so often, our knees would brush under the desk, accidental or deliberate, I still couldn't tell, and I'd feel that tight, hollow tug in my chest. My thoughts kept racing ahead of my actions, but I stayed still. Restraint felt like survival. At one point, she looked up, a faint shadow of fatigue lining her eyes, and I wanted, so badly, to reach over, to brush that stray hair off her forehead, to offer some small comfort. But the words wouldn't come, my hand wouldn't move, and the storm outside reminded me how fragile this moment was. A creak in the hallway pulled our attention, and for a second, the spell broke. The office door opened just enough for a colleague to peek in, and she quickly straightened, tucking the papers closer to her chest, snapping back into the world. My pulse, still racing, had to settle again. The moment that had been suspended between us evaporated like mist, leaving only awareness. I sat back, hands folded in my lap, staring at her silhouette against the rain-streaked window. She rubbed her temples, a subtle gesture of weariness, and I couldn't stop imagining tracing the line of her hand, feeling that connection, even briefly. Our eyes met again, a flicker, and the world seemed to pause. The room contracted to just her and me, the rain, and the quiet thrum of something unspoken. I leaned forward, just slightly, testing the invisible boundary that kept us apart. She tilted her head toward me, almost imperceptibly. I could feel the warmth, the pull, the dangerous invitation in that quiet space, but before anything happened, the phone buzzed again. She jumped slightly, breaking the tension, pulling back as if remembering a rule she couldn't bend. I exhaled slowly, hands trembling a fraction. We were inches apart, yet miles from crossing that line. But in that charged silence, I realized how impossible it was to ignore what hung between us. And for a fleeting second, I almost reached out. Almost. We ended up in the small rooftop cafe after work, the city lights glimmering through the misty drizzle. The hum of distant traffic was soft, almost respectful, giving space for what neither of us wanted to say. I stared at the rim of my coffee cup, pretending it held all the answers, while she watched the rain trace silver lines across the glass barrier. "You ever feel like you're just pretending?" I asked, finally breaking the silence, though my voice was softer than I meant. She didn't turn to me immediately. She folded her hands in her lap, the faintest tension in her shoulders. "Pretending what?" Her words were careful, measured, but I could see the twitch of something in her eyes, uncertainty, maybe guilt, maybe a flicker of the same thing I was feeling. Like we're normal. Like none of this matters. I swallowed, feeling my chest tighten. And maybe it shouldn't. But it does. Her laugh was quiet, almost bitter. "We're adults. We handle things. Responsibilities, appearances." She let the sentence hang in the air, incomplete, as if the missing part was the truth neither of us dared to name. I watched her hands again, how they gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale under the light. I wanted to reach over, to ease that tension, but I couldn't. Something in me knew it would change everything if I did. "I can't stop noticing you," I admitted, almost too quietly, and immediately wished I hadn't. The words weren't romantic, not really, they were a confession of awareness, of how sharp the pull between us had become, of how wrong it felt to feel this way at all. She didn't respond. Her gaze dropped to the table, tracing a drip of condensation as if it held some secret she couldn't speak. I realized she wasn't angry. She wasn't laughing. She was just considering, weighing, balancing something I couldn't reach. "I don't know what we're doing," I tried again, forcing my voice steady while my fingers drummed on the tabletop. "I know we're careful. I know it's nothing, at least, that's what we tell ourselves, but it feels like it's more." Her eyes lifted then, meeting mine with a slow, deliberate honesty that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. "Maybe we don't get to decide what it is," she said, almost whispering. "Maybe it decides us." I felt the pull in my chest tighten, a mix of longing and helplessness. The rain streaked further down the glass, the city a blur behind it, and for the first time, the boundaries between her and me felt porous, fragile. But we didn't reach for each other. We didn't close the distance. Instead, we let the silence stretch, heavy with truths we weren't ready to name. I wanted to ask her what she meant, to make her clarify, to hold her and tell her it would be fine. But my hands stayed on my lap. My voice stayed silent. my heart stayed tethered to the dangerous weight of the unspoken. Finally, she stood, slipping her notebook under her arm. She didn't look away from me, but she didn't speak either. Just before she walked to the elevator, she whispered, "I'm tired of being careful." And in that moment, I realized I wasn't the only one. I never expected the storm to follow us inside. Not the rain, the way it splattered against the windows, but the storm in her voice, soft and brittle, that seemed to shake the air around us. We were in her small apartment now, the faint scent of old books and vanilla drifting through the room. She had offered me tea, but neither of us touched the cups. "I wasn't always like this," she said suddenly, voice low, almost reluctant. She traced a finger along the edge of a photo frame on her shelf, hesitant. "I left someone a long time ago. Thought it was the right choice then. Thought I could manage without it." I froze, the words hanging between us like smoke. Not a dramatic confession, not a tearful declaration, just a simple truth she had carried, carefully folded into herself for years. "Was it hard?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She gave a small, ironic laugh, bitter but tinged with sadness. "Hard? Yes. Easy? No. But life doesn't wait for easy." Her eyes, usually so guarded, softened, and I caught the slightest tremor in her hands as she rested them on the edge of the table. I thought of the mornings I had watched her in the repair shop, the quiet moments in the cafe, the almost touch in the office. All the small, silent electricity between us now felt heavier, knowing she had carried that loss, that heartbreak, that careful restraint all this time. Then I noticed the envelope tucked beneath the photo, a letter, old and creased, almost hidden. She glanced at it, hesitated, then slid it toward me. "I never sent it," she whispered. "Never could." I hesitated, lifting it slowly, feeling the weight of her past pressed into my hands. The handwriting was elegant, careful, intimate in a way that made the air thicken. It was addressed to him, the man she had left, the one who had mattered. I didn't read it aloud. I didn't need to. The act itself was enough, a fragment of a life she had carefully concealed, now open, trembling between us. "You're still carrying it," I said softly, almost to myself. "Yes," she admitted, finally meeting my eyes. Her gaze held a mixture of shame and release, of vulnerability I had only glimpsed in fleeting moments. "I never thought anyone would see it. I never thought anyone would know." I wanted to reach for her, to hold her hand, to tell her that seeing her like this didn't scare me, that it made her human, alive, real. But I didn't. Instead, I placed the envelope back gently, letting her have the space she needed, letting her decide if I was part of it. We sat in silence after that, the rain pattering softly against the glass, the hum of the city distant and irrelevant. And in that quiet, the air between us shifted subtly but irrevocably. There was no confession of love, no rush of passion, just the seismic tremor of trust, of exposure, of truth laid bare. Finally, she looked at me, her lips parted slightly, eyes shimmering with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I didn't expect to tell anyone," she said, almost a whisper. I nodded, swallowing hard. Neither did I. And in that moment, nothing more needed to be said. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had shifted. We didn't speak for a long time. The cafe had emptied, chairs stacked in corners, the hum of the heater soft and steady. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and reflective. I watched her stir her tea absent-mindedly, the steam curling between us like smoke from a candle. Finally, she looked at me, and for the first time, there was no pretense, no guardedness, no deflection, just her. "We've been careful," she said softly. "Too careful, maybe." I nodded, unsure if I wanted to say more. Words felt inadequate. They always did, when it came to her. Instead, I reached slowly, letting my fingers brush hers on the table. She didn't pull away. I don't know what this is, she admitted, almost to herself. Or where it goes. But I know I notice it. Notice you. I swallowed. That was enough. Not a declaration of love, not a promise. Just acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement carried weight. It was fragile, honest, human. We let our hands rest together, tentatively, the warmth a quiet anchor. Around us, the world moved on, but in that little bubble, time slowed. I could feel the gentle pulse of her fingers against mine, the subtle tremor in her wrist, the soft exhale of someone finally letting down a shield. She leaned slightly closer, tilting her head just enough for our shoulders to brush. No words, no need for them. Everything we hadn't said, the glances, the pauses, the small sparks, was finally understood, not forced, just quietly accepted. The room seemed to hold its breath with us, and I realized how much I had wanted this moment, not in a dramatic way, but in the slow, patient accumulation of all the little pauses, the unspoken tension, the near misses. Her gaze dropped, and I followed, our eyes meeting only briefly, as if acknowledging a shared secret. Then, without speaking, she shifted her hands slightly, letting mine rest fully over hers. The small, simple gesture sealed something that words never could. I didn't lean in. She didn't lean in. We didn't need to. The connection was in the silence, the shared understanding, the decision not to rush, but to be present in this fragile, earned space together. For a long moment, we just sat there, side by side, fingers intertwined, shoulders touching lightly, letting the quiet fill every corner of the room. No promises, no confessions, just presence. And in that presence, the years, the mistakes, the past heartbreaks, they all softened, held at bay by something stronger than words. Finally, she exhaled, a gentle sigh that seemed to release the tension in both of us. Maybe this is enough, she murmured. I nodded, resting my hand lightly on hers, feeling the subtle warmth, the pulse of life and trust and quiet inevitability. It is, I said softly. And in that soft, unspoken way, we were together. Looking back, I realize it wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It was the small things, the pauses, the glances, the way she let her guard drop just enough for me to see the person behind it. She wasn't someone who needed saving, and I wasn't trying to save her. We were just there, learning how to exist in the same space without fear, without pretense. She's still the same woman who commands a room without trying, who laughs softly but sharply, who carries both confidence and a quiet vulnerability. But now, there's something lighter in her eyes, a softness I didn't see before. Maybe it's the weight she no longer has to carry alone, or maybe it's the realization that some connections aren't about control, they're about presence, about noticing someone and letting them notice you back. And me? I'm different too. I've learned that wanting someone isn't a flaw. That admiration can coexist with hesitation, and longing doesn't have to be reckless. I've learned patience, attention to detail, not in work or life, but in the human spaces in between. I've learned that sometimes love, or whatever this was, is built in fragments, in quiet, earned moments, not fireworks. What changed between us wasn't a dramatic leap, it was an accumulation of small, deliberate choices. To pause, to notice, to respect the silences as much as the words. To let a touch speak when words might fail. And in doing so, we discovered a connection that wasn't easy or perfect, but it was ours. Real. Human. I think about how fragile it all could have been, one rushed step, one misread glance, and I shiver at the thought. But we let it unfold slowly, letting the world outside our bubble recede until the only thing that mattered was that quiet, steady acknowledgement. We had found each other in a way that didn't need loud affirmation, but simply needed presence. Sitting here now, I remember the brush of her fingers against mine, the way her gaze held mine without demanding, the gentle exhale that sealed our understanding. I realized that those small moments carried more weight than any dramatic confession ever could. And I smile, quietly, because it was enough. It always was. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?